In March 2015, tragedy struck the quiet German town of Haltern am See. 16 schoolchildren, excited for the adventure of a lifetime, had won the chance to join a weekend exchange trip to Spain. But what should have been a joyful journey ended in unthinkable horror. Instead of returning home with memories and stories to share, these teenagers, along with 134 others, lost their lives in one of Europe's most shocking aviation disasters. A catastrophe not caused by weather, nor by mechanical failure, but by the deliberate actions of a single man locked inside the cockpit. This is the haunting story of Germanwings Flight 9525. On the morning of March 24th, 2015, 14-year-old Henrik Drupal sat in his English class in the small German town of Haltern am See. It was an ordinary school day until the loudspeaker crackled to life. The principal's voice trembled. "We believe something terrible has happened. School is over. Go home." Confused, Henrik stepped into the hallway. Teachers were huddled in corners, many of them in tears, and whispers filled the corridors. Then a classmate approached with the words that would change his life forever. "The plane from Barcelona. It's crashed." In that instant, Henrik knew. His sister Leah, along with 15 classmates and 2 of their teachers, would never come home. They had been passengers on Germanwings Flight 9525. Germanwings was the low-cost subsidiary of Lufthansa, Germany's national airline. On March 24, 2015, one of its aircraft, an Airbus A320-211, prepared for a routine return flight from Barcelona to Düsseldorf. The A320 was a workhorse of the skies, modern, reliable, and trusted by airlines around the world. For passengers, it was just another ordinary flight at the tail end of a busy travel season, with business travellers and holidaymakers filling the cabin. This was the aircraft's second journey of the day. Earlier that morning, it had flown from Düsseldorf to Barcelona without incident, landing shortly before 8 a.m. The same 6 crew members would remain on board for the return leg, welcoming a fresh group of passengers for what should have been an uneventful 2-hour flight home. At the controls that day was Captain Patrick Sondenheimer, 34 years old, a seasoned pilot with more than 6,000 flight hours to his name. Beside him sat his first officer, 27-year-old Andreas Lubitz, far less experienced but qualified to handle the Airbus A320. On the surface, their earlier flight from Düsseldorf to Barcelona had seemed uneventful. The jet had cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, autopilot engaged, while the crew carried out their routine checks. But investigators would later discover something disturbing buried in the flight data. When Captain Sondenheimer briefly left the cockpit, perhaps for a restroom break, Lubitz took control. Without warning, he dialed the autopilot altitude down from 35,000 feet to just 100 feet, the lowest setting possible, before quickly resetting it back again. It happened not once, but at least twice. Small, subtle actions, but chilling in hindsight. It looked less like a mistake and more like practice. A short time later, the Airbus was prepared for its return journey to Düsseldorf. New passengers boarded, unaware of the sinister rehearsal that had already taken place. Clearance from the tower was granted, and at 9 a.m. the jet began its takeoff roll. The climb was smooth and uneventful. Once the landing gear was retracted, the autopilot was engaged, guiding the aircraft upwards through the clear morning sky. By 9:27, Germanwings Flight 9525 had levelled off at its cruising altitude, 38,000 feet. From the outside, it was just another routine flight. Inside the cockpit, Captain Patrick Sondenheimer prepared to step out for a brief restroom break. Before leaving, he gave his co-pilot a short list of standard tasks: check the landing gear systems, review the approach checklist, and confirm the weather ahead. With less than 2 hours of flying time remaining, it was all routine, nothing out of the ordinary. Normally, the response from a first officer would be crisp and professional. "Yes, Captain." But Andreas Lubitz's reply was anything but routine. He said, "Hopefully, we'll see." It was a strange, unsettling comment, cryptic enough to give pause. And yet, with the flight on course, the instruments steady, and air traffic control in contact as expected, Captain Sondenheimer let it slide. Handing over responsibility, he gave his final instruction: "You're now responsible for radio communications while I'm out." And with that, he stepped out of the cockpit, never realizing he had just surrendered command of the aircraft to the man who would bring it down. In the aftermath of 9/11, airlines around the world reinforced cockpit security. Doors were rebuilt with armoured plating designed to withstand bullets and forced entry. Access was controlled by electronic keypads, allowing pilots outside the cockpit to punch in a code and regain entry if their colleague inside became incapacitated. But those safeguards had one fatal flaw. From inside the cockpit, a simple switch could disable the override, locking the door completely. When Captain Sondenheimer stepped out for his break, Andreas Lubitz reached down and flicked that switch. In that instant, the cockpit was sealed. No emergency code, no crew member, not even the captain himself would be able to get back in. Lubitz was alone at the controls. Barely 30 seconds after the captain left, Lubitz began to reprogram the aircraft. First, he dialed the autopilot altitude down. Not by a few thousand feet, but from 38,000 all the way to 100 feet above the ground. Then he switched the autopilot into open descent, a mode that would send the plane steadily downwards towards the altitude he had chosen. Next, he pulled the engines back to idle, stripping the Airbus of its cruising power. Minutes later, he switched the throttles to manual, locking in a descent speed of just over 300 knots. Slowly at first, the aircraft began to sink, 1,000 feet per minute, and then more. At times, the descent surged towards 5,000 feet per minute. But in the cabin, nothing seemed amiss. The seatbelt sign was off, the engines hummed steadily, and there were no warnings to alert the crew. To those on board, it must have felt like a minor adjustment. All the while, Lubitz was deliberately guiding the Airbus towards disaster. On radar screens in southern France, the descent did not go unnoticed. At the Marseille Control Centre, an air traffic controller spotted the Airbus dropping rapidly from its assigned altitude. He called the cockpit. "Germanwings 9525, confirm your altitude." There was no reply, but through the open radio channel he could hear faint, steady breathing. Lubitz was alive and at the controls. Again and again the controller tried to raise the flight. Still silence. Growing concerned, he alerted French air defense, asking their controllers to make contact. Another airliner in the region was also asked to reach out on the same frequency. But every attempt ended the same way. No response. The Airbus continued its silent fall from the sky. Inside the cockpit, Lubitz pushed the descent even further. Adjusting the speed, he forced the aircraft down at an even steeper rate. On the ground, French air defense now feared the worst. A Mirage fighter was scrambled to intercept the Airbus and assess the situation. Meanwhile, Captain Sondenheimer had returned to the cockpit door. He keyed in the emergency code, but nothing happened. The door remained locked. Realizing what was happening, he began pounding on the reinforced barrier, shouting for Lubitz to open up. The cockpit voice recorder captured every moment: the captain's desperate pleas, the hammering of his fists against the armoured door, his frustration mounting with every second. But inside, Lubitz said nothing. He simply continued the descent. When Captain Sondenheimer realized that the Airbus was plunging into a steep, uncontrolled dive, panic set in. He called for an emergency axe, the last tool available to force entry into the cockpit. With desperate strength, he swung it against the reinforced door. But the door held firm. No matter how hard he struck, it would not give way. In the cabin, passengers began to hear the commotion, the sound of the captain shouting, and the dull thud of metal striking the cockpit door, and the growing terror in his voice. Inside, alarms were now blaring. The cockpit voice recorder captured the automated warnings echoing through the flight deck. "Pull up! Pull up!" Sondenheimer would have heard those words through the door, a final devastating confirmation of what was about to happen. For 11 agonizing minutes, Germanwings Flight 9525 continued its deadly descent. On radar screens, controllers watched helplessly as the Airbus fell lower and lower. And then, at 9:41 a.m., the signals vanished, and the flight data recorder stopped transmitting. In that instant, the aircraft slammed into a mountainside in the French Alps at a speed of over 435 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The Airbus shattered into thousands of pieces, scattering wreckage across the remote terrain. There were no survivors. All 150 people on board, including the 6 crew members and 16 German schoolchildren, were killed instantly. The crash site lay deep in the French Alps, in terrain so rugged that ground teams could not reach it on foot. Emergency services faced an exhausting climb that would take hours, so the only way in was by helicopter. When rescuers were finally lowered onto the mountainside, the scale of destruction was overwhelming. The Airbus had been obliterated on impact, reduced to fragments scattered across the slopes. There was almost nothing recognisable left of the aircraft or of its passengers. The following day, March 25th, French authorities airlifted investigators from the BEA, the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, to begin their work. Amid the wreckage, they discovered the cockpit voice recorder. It was battered, but intact. It would take another week before the second black box, the flight data recorder, was located. Once recovered, both were rushed to BEA headquarters in Paris. Together, these devices would reveal the final minutes of Germanwings Flight 9525 and the chilling truth behind the tragedy. So how could a tragedy of this scale happen? To understand, investigators had to turn their attention to the man at the controls, First Officer Andreas Lubitz. Lubitz was born in 1982 in the town of Montabaur, Germany, midway between Düsseldorf and Frankfurt. From an early age, he was fascinated by aviation. He earned his glider pilot's license as a teenager and dreamed of one day flying passenger jets. After finishing high school in 2007, he set his sights on Lufthansa, Germany's national airline. The carrier was advertising for cadets, offering the chance to turn dreams of flight into a career. For Lubitz, it was an opportunity he couldn't resist. In 2008, after a rigorous selection process, he was accepted into Lufthansa's Flight Academy. Only 5% of applicants made the cut. On paper, Lubitz had the passion, the skill, and the discipline to succeed. But behind the ambition, darker struggles were already beginning to surface. In September 2008, Andreas Lubitz began his training at Lufthansa's flight school in Bremen, joining 200 other cadets chasing the same dream. The first year would be spent in the classroom, before advancing to practical flight training in Arizona. But within weeks, the dream began to fracture. By November, Lubitz had abruptly dropped out and returned home. Behind the decision lay a devastating diagnosis. A local psychiatrist determined he was suffering from a major depressive episode. He was plagued by suicidal thoughts and prescribed powerful antidepressants. For months he underwent intensive therapy, but his struggles deepened. On top of his depression, Lubitz developed tinnitus, a relentless ringing in the ears that no amount of silence could erase. For him, it compounded the depression, dragging him deeper into crisis. He spent 9 months in therapy before showing signs of remission. Eventually, his psychiatrist judged him stable enough to continue pursuing his dream and wrote to the German Aviation Authority recommending that he be allowed back into flight training. The authorities did approve his return, but with conditions. His medical file was flagged, requiring regular examinations to ensure that he'd not relapsed. It's staggering that barely months into his training, the warning signs were already flashing, and yet somehow his path to the cockpit remained open. By early 2010, Andreas Lubitz had completed his studies at Bremen and was preparing to travel to Arizona for hands-on flight training. But before he could, there was one more step: paperwork for the US Federal Aviation Administration. One of the questions was simple: have you ever experienced episodes of depression? Lubitz answered, no. It was a lie, and it was one that didn't go unnoticed. A German doctor reviewing the forms flagged the discrepancy before the documents ever reached American officials. In most cases, lying to a federal authority could be treated as perjury, an offence serious enough to end a career or even result in jail time. But Lubitz wasn't punished. Instead, he was told to provide a detailed medical history and a certificate from his doctors. He complied, and with that, the door was once again open. In Arizona, he logged over 100 hours in the cockpit of small training aircraft like the Beechcraft Bonanza, and spent countless more inside flight simulators. Piece by piece, he was rebuilding his path to the skies, and hiding the shadows that had nearly stopped him before his career had even begun. By 2011, Lubitz was back in Germany, continuing his training. He progressed onto jets and by 2013 secured a position with Germanwings. His career appeared to be back on track. On the surface, everything seemed to be falling into place. He had a well-paying job, enough to afford a luxury apartment. He had a girlfriend, a schoolteacher called Catherine Goldbach, with whom he spoke about marriage. He visited his parents in Montauban often, presenting himself as a dutiful son and a reliable professional. To friends, colleagues and family, Andreas Lubitz looked every bit the picture of a stable young pilot. But it was an illusion. Records uncovered after the crash would reveal that around Christmas 2014, Lubitz suffered a devastating relapse. He spiraled into another major depressive episode. Police later discovered chilling evidence on his personal computer. Searches for painless ways to commit suicide, methods of poisoning, and detailed research into the security systems of the Airbus A320. Behind the polished exterior, Lubitz was quietly unravelling. As his condition worsened, new symptoms began to emerge. He became convinced he was going blind, describing strange visual disturbances, phantom flashes, swarms of insects that weren't really there. He visited multiple ophthalmologists and private physicians, but none could find anything physically wrong with his eyes. One doctor labelled him a hypochondriac. Another feared something far more serious, warning that Lubitz was experiencing psychotic episodes and urging him to check himself into a clinic. He refused. Ordinarily, such a cascade of red flags might have alerted his employer. But in Germany at the time, strict privacy laws tied doctors' hands. Lubitz received medical certificates declaring him unfit to fly. Yet, he simply chose not to forward them to Lufthansa or Germanwings, and by law, his doctors were forbidden from doing so themselves. The result? Despite multiple diagnoses of psychiatric illness, Andreas Lubitz remained on active flight status. From that point, everything spiraled. By March 22nd, investigators believe Andreas Lubitz had already made up his mind. He would end his life. But his plan went far beyond suicide. 2 days later, he would carry it out. Not alone, but with 149 unsuspecting souls trapped on board with him. The final report by French air crash investigators left no doubt. Germanwings Flight 9525 was not the victim of mechanical failure or sudden weather or chance. It was deliberately flown into the side of a mountain by its own first officer, Andreas Lubitz. In the aftermath of the tragedy, investigators and regulators across Europe faced urgent questions. How could one man sitting alone in a cockpit bring down an entire aircraft? Almost immediately, airlines introduced what became known as the two-person rule. At no time would a pilot be left alone at the controls. If one stepped out of the cockpit, another crew member had to step in. It was a safeguard designed to prevent a repeat of Germanwings 9525. For a year, the rule remained in place, but quietly it was later rolled back, deemed impractical by some carriers. Meanwhile, Lufthansa, the parent company of Germanwings, paid compensation to the families of the 150 victims. Settlements were offered not only for financial loss, but also for the immense suffering inflicted on parents, spouses, and siblings who would never see their loved ones again. The crash also sparked a wider reckoning in aviation. Regulators called for more stringent psychological screening of pilots, with an emphasis on detecting depression, psychiatric disorders and suicidal tendencies, vulnerabilities that had previously remained hidden behind medical privacy laws. It was a tragedy that forced the industry to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest danger to a modern airliner might not be mechanical failure or terrorism or even the weather, but the pilot sitting at the controls. One can only hope that the lessons of Germanwings 9525 will ensure that no one like Andreas Lubitz is ever again in a position to take so many innocent lives with him. But obviously this was a very, very tragic story with the loss of many, many lives, and our condolences go out to the friends and family of the people who lost their lives. But I hope you like the way this material was presented. I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one, and I'll say bye-bye for now.